2 security men had a rumpled stranger by the arms and were walking him backward toward the doors of a wedding reception outside Charleston. And 300 guests in linen and silk had turned to watch a man be removed from a celebration he had, apparently, no business attending. The father of the bride had given the order himself. Quietly, firmly, get him out. The man did not struggle. He did not raise his voice. He did not say the one sentence that most men would have led with, "Do you know who I am?" A sentence he happened to have every right to say. He said something else instead. 6 seconds. One quiet sentence, aimed at no one and everyone. And a wedding of 300 people went completely, utterly still. The band stopped. A woman set down her glass without a sound, and the father of the bride, who a moment before had been the most powerful man on that lawn, felt the ground open under his polished shoes. Because the rumpled stranger being dragged toward the doors was the only family the groom had in the entire world. And everyone was about to find out exactly what that meant. There is a historic estate on the water outside Charleston, South Carolina, all live oaks and Spanish moss, and a white house that has stood since before anyone at the wedding was born. On a warm evening in late September, it hosted the marriage of Ava Pruitt and Jonah Reyes, and it was, by any measure, a beautiful wedding, tents strung with 1,000 small lights, oysters and low country boil, a band that knew how to make grandmothers dance. But if you had watched carefully during the ceremony, you'd have noticed something. The bride's side of the aisle was full. Charleston old money and new money, business partners, cousins to the 4th degree, a former mayor. And the groom's side was nearly empty. A best man, 3 friends, a handful of people, and a great many folding chairs on the groom's side, with no one in them at all, because Jonah Reyes had no family. He had grown up in the foster system, 6 placements, 3 group homes, aged out at 18, with a garbage bag of clothes and no one waiting. He had built a good life anyway, through a stubbornness that took your breath away, and he had won the heart of Ava Pruitt, who saw him clearly and completely, and did not care in the slightest that he'd come from nothing. But on his wedding day, the empty chairs on his side of the aisle said the thing out loud that no one would say. This boy has no people. Except that he did have one. One person, and that person's flight had been delayed 4 hours out of the West Coast, and Jonah had been checking the doors all evening with a tightness in his chest. Because the one man he needed there more than anyone, the closest thing to a father he had ever had not yet arrived. His name was Marcus Rourke. If you had watched movies in the last 20 years, you knew the face. The quiet one, the reluctant hero. The man who did the hard right thing at the worst possible cost to himself. What almost no one at the wedding knew was that Marcus Rourke had himself grown up in foster care. 4 years of it, and that this was the reason, the private, unpublicized reason, that his foundation ran a mentorship program for kids aging out of the system, and that 13 years ago it had paired a furious, brilliant, terrified 15-year-old named Jonah with a mentor who never once in 13 years missed a birthday, a graduation, a bad night, or a phone call. Marcus had raised Jonah as much as anyone had. And on the most important day of the boy's life, Marcus's plane had finally landed, and he had driven straight from the airport in the travel clothes he'd been wearing for 11 hours, wrinkled trousers, an open collar, a sport coat thrown on in the rental car, and he had slipped quietly through a side gate during the reception. Rumpled and unshaven and looking exactly like a man who did not belong at a wedding this expensive, hoping only to find Jonah and tell him he'd made it. He found something else first. He found the father of the bride. The father of the bride was named Charles Pruitt, and to understand what he did that night, You have to understand that he was not, at his core, a cruel man. He was a bereaved one. And a bereaved man clinging to the last thing he has will do terrible things to keep from feeling it slip away. Charles was 58, and he had built a shipping and logistics empire out of nothing across 30 years, and he commanded every room he entered the way some men breathe. But the center of Charles Pruitt's life had never been the empire. It had been his daughter. Because when Ava was 6 years old, Charles's wife, Ava's mother, the love of his life, had died, suddenly, in a spring that Charles never fully talked about. And Charles had made a decision in the worst grief of his life. He decided he would be everything for that little girl. Both parents. An unbreakable wall between her and any more loss. He would be so much for Ava that she would never feel the size of what she'd lost. And he had done it. He had raised her alone. He had braided hair badly and learned to, coached the soccer team, cried in the car after every school play so she wouldn't see. His entire identity, the whole reason he got out of bed after his wife died, had reorganized itself around one fact. My daughter needs me. Being needed by Ava was the load-bearing wall of Charles Pruitt's soul. And now Ava was 27. And she was marrying a man she loved, and she was, in the most natural and beautiful way in the world, walking out of the center of Charles's life and into the center of her own. And Charles Pruitt was, though he would have died before admitting it, absolutely terrified. Because the day he gave her away was the day he stopped being the thing he'd rebuilt his whole self to be. When the wedding ended, he would drive home to a house that had his wife's absence in every room, and now his daughter's too, and he would be, at 58, exactly what he'd spent 21 years outrunning. Alone, unneeded, no one's anything. He couldn't say any of that, so it came out sideways, the way grief does in men who won't call it grief. It came out as coldness toward Jonah, a boy with nothing. A boy from nowhere, a boy Charles could not understand his daughter choosing. Because in Charles's frightened arithmetic, a man from nothing could not possibly protect her the way Charles had. And all weekend the empty chairs on the groom's side had rubbed something raw in him. Because a boy with no family was a living picture of the loneliness Charles was staring down, and Charles could not look at it. So when a rumpled, unshaven stranger came through the side gate during the reception, drifting toward the head of the room where Jonah stood, a shabby man who looked like exactly the kind of nobody Jonah came from, every ounce of Charles Pruitt's panic found its target. Here, finally, was something he could control on a day that was taking everything from him. Here was a way to still be the man who protects, the man who decides, the man who matters. He caught the eye of the venue's security. He nodded toward Marcus, and he said, low and certain, "That man is not a guest. Get him out." Quietly now, "It's my daughter's wedding, and I decide who's here." The two security men reached Marcus just as he'd spotted Jonah across the crowd and lifted a hand to wave. Sir, come with us please. A hand on each arm. You're going to need to leave." "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I'm a guest. Jonah invited me. I'm just here for, sir. We've been told you're not on the list. Let's not make this difficult." And they turned him, firmly, and began to walk him backward toward the doors. And the nearest tables noticed, and the noticing spread outward across the lawn like a stain, table by table, until half the wedding had turned to watch a rumpled man being marched out. Marcus could have ended it in a heartbeat. He had the sentence right there. "I'm Marcus Rourke," and the whole thing would have collapsed in shock and apology. He didn't say it. Because saying it would have made the night about him, and this night was Jonah's, And even now, even being manhandled toward the exit in front of 300 strangers, Marcus Rourke's only thought was that he did not want to become a scene at that boy's wedding. Jonah still hadn't seen. He was turned away, laughing at something, his back to the doors. And so Marcus stopped walking, planted his feet just enough to still the men holding him, and he did not shout, and he did not announce himself, and he said, in a voice pitched low but clear enough to carry across a lawn that had gone quiet to listen, "That boy getting married tonight has no one in the world, and I'm the one who came." The lawn went completely still. The band stopped between notes. A woman set her glass down on a table without a sound. 300 people who had been watching a stranger get removed suddenly understood that they were watching something else entirely, though most of them did not yet know what. And across the room, Jonah Reyes heard it. Heard the voice. He turned and saw two men holding the arms of the one person on earth he'd been watching the doors for all night. And the color left his face and he said, "No." And then he was moving, shoving through the crowd, and his voice cracked as it rose. "Let him go. Let him go. That's my." He couldn't finish it. He reached them and pulled the security men's hands off Marcus's arms with a strength that startled everyone, and then Jonah Reyes, 28 years old on his wedding day, threw his arms around the rumpled stranger and held on like a drowning man, and said into his shoulder, loud enough for the silent lawn to hear, "You came. You made it. I was so scared you weren't going to make it." And Charles Pruitt stood at the edge of it all and understood, in a single cascading wave of horror, that he had just ordered security to drag out the only father his daughter's husband had ever known. Somewhere in the crowd, a guest who'd been squinting at the stranger's face finally placed it, and a whisper went up. Isn't that Marcus Rourke?" And it rippled outward as a second, smaller shock. But almost no one was listening to that part. They were watching a groom with no family hold on to the one man who'd shown up for him, and the fame of it was the least remarkable thing on that lawn. Marcus felt Charles across the room before he saw him, the way you feel the person whose whole world just came apart. He found him standing rigid by the head table, ashen, staring at his new son-in-law weeping into a stranger's shoulder. Marcus disentangled himself gently from Jonah. "I'm okay. I'm okay. Go be with your wife. I've got something to do first." And he crossed to Charles Pruitt. And he said quietly, just for him, "Is there somewhere we can talk? Just us, away from all this." They went into the estate's library, off the main hall, and Marcus closed the door. And he sat down, and Charles sat down heavily across from him, like a man whose legs had stopped believing in him. And the first thing Marcus said undid every defense the man had left. "I didn't say who I was out there," Marcus said, "because I didn't want to make your daughter's wedding about me. And I'm not in here to make you feel worse than you already do. I promise you that." He paused. A man doesn't try to throw a stranger out of his own daughter's wedding because he's cruel. He does it because something is happening to him that he can't stand and can't name. "So tell me, Charles, what's really happening to you tonight?" And Charles Pruitt, who had not said the true thing out loud to a single soul in 21 years, told a man he'd just tried to have removed. He told him about Ava's mother, about the spring she died, and the 6-year-old girl, and the decision he'd made in the worst grief of his life to be everything for her so she'd never feel the size of what she lost. He told him about the braids and the soccer team and crying in the car after the school plays. And he told him the thing underneath all of it, the thing he was most ashamed of, that being needed by his daughter was the only reason he'd found to keep going after his wife died, and that tonight he was giving her away, and that when this beautiful party ended, he would drive home to a house with 2 absences in it now instead of 1, and be a man alone at 58 with no one who needed him for anything. And that boy, Charles said, and his voice broke on it, with the empty chairs on his side of the aisle, he's everything I'm afraid of. A person with no one. And I couldn't understand why she'd choose someone from nothing. Someone who couldn't protect her the way I. He stopped. He put his face in his hands. And so I tried to throw out the one person who came for him. My God. What is wrong with me? Marcus did not interrupt. He let it all land. Then he told Charles something true. I grew up the way Jonah did, he said quietly. Foster homes. 4 years. Nobody, so did that boy out there. And I'll tell you what I know about a kid who grows up with no father that you can't know, because you've been a father since the day he was born. He leaned forward. We don't take it for granted. Not for one single day. A kid who never had a dad and then finally gets one, he'll treasure that man in a way that a kid who always had one never quite can. It's the difference between a person who's always had water and a person who spent years thirsty. Then he asked the question he'd come into that library to ask. You're so terrified of losing a daughter tonight, Marcus said, that you can't see what you're actually being handed. You think you're at the end of being needed. Charles, you're being handed the one young man on this earth who will never ever take a father for granted, because he spent 28 years without one and knows exactly what it's worth. You're not losing Ava. You're gaining a son who's been waiting his whole life for you. He held the man's eyes. So here's the only question that matters. Years from now, when Ava thinks back on her wedding day, do you want her to remember it as the night her father tried to drag her husband's family out the door? Or the night he walked out there and became that boy's family himself? Charles Pruitt closed his eyes. That was the beat. The whole thing turned on it. I don't want to be alone, Charles whispered. That's the whole ugly truth of it. I'm just so afraid of being alone. Then stop trying to keep her, Marcus said gently, standing, and start trying to gain him. That's how you're not alone. Not by holding on, by opening up. He put a hand on the man's shoulder. There's a kid out there who has been looking at empty chairs all night. Go fill one. Charles Pruitt walked back out onto that lawn, and 300 people watched him. Because 300 people had just watched him have a stranger dragged toward the doors and were braced for what a man like that did next. He did not go to Marcus. He crossed the lawn to Jonah, who stiffened as he approached, expecting the cold man he'd known for 2 years, and Charles Pruitt, who commanded every room he ever entered, who had not bent to anyone in decades, stopped in front of his daughter's husband. And in front of everyone, his voice unsteady and not hidden, he said, Jonah, I have been cold to you since the day I met you, and tonight I did something unforgivable, and you'd have every right never to call me anything but Charles for the rest of your life. He swallowed hard. But I'm going to ask you for something I don't deserve. I lost Ava's mother when Ava was 6. And I've spent 21 years so afraid of losing more that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. You've got a whole side of an aisle sitting empty out here. And I've got a house that's about to be too quiet, and a lot of years left of being somebody's father with nobody to be it for. His voice cracked all the way through. So if you'll have me, badly and late, and after everything, I would be proud to be your family. I would be proud to fill one of those chairs. Jonah Reyes could not speak. He just nodded, and then he was crying, and then the two of them were holding on to each other, and near the head table, an 84-year-old woman named Ruth, Ava's grandmother, the one person in that whole family who had welcomed Jonah warmly from the very first day, who had spent this entire evening quietly furious at her son's coldness and uncertain whether to say so. Ruth put her hand over her mouth and wept, because she had prayed for exactly this and had not believed she'd live to see it. And the applause that started then was not led and did not need to be led. And near the doors, in his rumpled travel clothes, Marcus Rourke watched a fatherless boy get a father, and a grieving father get a son. And he did not move to the center of it, because that was never why he came. When the band started again, and the family folded in around Jonah, Marcus slipped out the side gate the way he'd come in and drove back toward the airport in the dark, and was gone before most of the wedding understood that the man they'd nearly thrown out had quietly handed two lonely people the rest of their lives. He was always gone before the credit arrived. That was the thing about Marcus. Here's the part the story usually skips. The slow part. The true part. It did not fix everything overnight. Nothing fixes anything overnight, and 21 years of a certain kind of grief does not evaporate because of one good night. For a while, Charles and Jonah were careful with each other, the way people are when they've decided to try but don't yet know how. But some things had started to move that couldn't be stopped. It began with Sunday dinners. Charles, who could not cook, learned to, badly, so there'd be a reason to have them at his too quiet house. Jonah came, and then Jonah and Ava came, and then it was every Sunday, and the house got louder. Charles started calling Jonah just to talk, about the business, about nothing. The way fathers call sons, and Jonah, who had spent 28 years with no one to call, saved every one of those calls in a way you can't save a voicemail, somewhere behind his ribs. Charles taught him the shipping business, not because Jonah needed a job, but because teaching your kid a trade is a thing a father gets to do, and Charles had a lot of years of that stored up with nowhere to spend it. When Jonah and Ava's first child came, 2 years later, they named her after Ava's mother, the wife Charles had lost. And Charles Pruitt held that baby in the hospital and wept in a way his daughter had never once seen. And Jonah put a hand on the old man's shoulder and said, "You're not alone anymore. You haven't been for a while. It just took us a minute." And the baby, when she learned to talk, called Charles Pop. And it was the best word Charles Pruitt ever heard in his life. Ruth, the grandmother, got her wish and then some. She and Jonah became thick as thieves. She said he was the only one in the family who'd sit and listen to her old stories all the way to the end. And when she passed, peacefully, at 89, she left Jonah a letter that said she'd known from the first handshake that he was the best thing to ever happen to this family, and that she was glad she'd lived long enough to be proved right. Years later, a local magazine did a piece on the Pruitt Shipping Company's next generation, and near the end the writer asked Charles about his son-in-law running the firm. Charles was quiet a while. "A man I tried to have thrown out of my daughter's wedding sat me down in a library," he said, "and told me I wasn't losing a daughter, I was gaining a son who'd never take me for granted." He was right about the second part. That boy has never taken a single day of having a father for granted, and it has taught me more about being one than the previous 58 years managed to. He almost smiled. I never even properly thanked the man. He was gone before I got the chance. But I fill the chair every Sunday. I think he'd count that as thanks enough. Marcus Rourke was asked about the wedding exactly once, at a junket for some film, when a clip of it surfaced online. He looked almost pained, like he wished they'd asked about anything else. Then he said, "That boy had a whole side of an aisle sitting empty, and a father-in-law scared to death of being alone. All I did was point out they were the answer to each other. They did the hard part," and he did not take the next question. He said, "Ask me about Jonah. I'll talk about Jonah all day." And they did. I have told a lot of stories on this channel. but I keep coming back to this one. And I've thought a long time about why, and I don't think it's the moment on the lawn, the security men, the stranger planting his feet, the one quiet sentence that stopped 300 people cold. That part gives me chills every time. I won't pretend it doesn't. That's the part we click for. But the part I actually keep is the sentence he chose. He had a shorter, easier one right there, his own name, and it would have ended everything in an instant and made every person on that lawn scramble to apologize to him. He didn't use it. He used 7 words that weren't about him at all. That boy has no one. And I came. He spent the one thing that could have saved his own dignity on protecting a boy's instead. And I think that's the whole thing. Because most of us, in the grip of a public humiliation, reach for whatever will make us look big. He reached for the thing that would make Jonah feel held. So here's the question the story left me with, and I don't have a clean answer for it. Charles Pruitt was cruel that night. And it turned out his cruelty was just fear wearing a hard face. The fear of being alone, of being unneeded, of driving home to a quiet house. And almost every hard, controlling, cold person you'll ever meet is running from some version of that same fear. The trick, the nearly impossible trick, is to see the frightened person inside the cruel one, while they're still being cruel to you. Would I have seen it? Or would I have just seen a rich man having me dragged out? Honestly, I'm not sure. Most of us aren't sure. And maybe that's the thing worth carrying off that lawn. That the lonely and the cruel are so often the same people, and that the bravest thing you can do is get close enough to tell. This story is fictional, inspired by the quiet kind of decency the best people are known for, the kind that spends its own dignity to protect someone else's. If it got to you, do me a favor down in the comments. Don't just say great story. Tell me about the person who filled an empty chair for you, or a chair you're glad you filled for someone else. I read every one. They're the best part of this. And if you know someone who's staring down an empty house, afraid of being alone, send them this. It might be the exact thing they need to hear today. If you're new here, subscribe. There's another story coming, and I'd be glad to have you for it. See you in the next one.